$1,000, then $3,000, then $8,000, then past $16,000, climbing in real time on a screen that should have shown zero. In 8 hours, a wrecked debt account had clawed its way back from nothing into nearly $20,000. Vu sat back in his chair and started laughing, half in disbelief, half in relief. He had no idea that this, the best moment of the entire story, was about to become the worst decision he ever made. To understand how he got here, we have to go back. Back before the money, back before any of it. This is based on a true story, shared with us by a man. To protect his privacy, in this story we'll call him Vu. And this isn't just his story. It's a crisis quietly destroying countless lives across Asia, especially in Vietnam. Stay with it until the end, and you'll understand just how deeply this can destroy a person's life. Vu doesn't actually remember the earliest years of his life. He was too young. But his mother told him the stories often enough that they became part of who he was. There was a time when there was almost no food in the house. Not for milk, not for proper meals, nothing. One day, his mother bought a few small fish on credit from the local market, promising she'd pay in a few days. When those days passed and she still had no money, the seller came looking for her. Seeing the woman approach from down the road, Vu's mother rushed inside, locked the door, and gently covered her baby's mouth with her hand, praying he wouldn't make a sound until the footsteps finally moved on. Another story stayed with him even more. His mother had left him with a neighbor while she went out to sell firewood. Hungry, Vu wandered home alone, found the door locked, and squeezed through a small gap at the bottom that was meant for a dog. Inside, he found a bunch of bananas hanging above the stove. He pulled a few down, ate them standing alone in the dark kitchen, drank water straight from a jug, and waited quietly until his mother returned. For a few years, life improved. His parents entered the timber business, money finally started flowing, and the family rose from poverty to a level of comfort they had never known before. Then it collapsed. When Vu was 15, a failed business deal left the family buried in debt. One afternoon, he came home to find a crowd gathered outside their house. Among them were people demanding money his family no longer had. He watched one of them slap his mother across the face. Something snapped inside him. Without thinking, he ran into the kitchen, grabbed the largest knife he could find, and started swinging at anyone who came near her. A neighbor called the police. The crowd eventually backed away. When it was over, Vu turned and saw his mother crying. He ran to her. The two of them stood there in the yard, holding each other as they sobbed. And that was the moment he made a promise that would define the next 15 years of his life. Hang in there, Mom. Someday I'm going to be rich, and I'm going to take care of you. Standing there at 15 years old, Vu thought he was making a simple promise. In reality, he had just given himself a mission. For the next 15 years, nearly every major decision he made would trace back to that moment in his mother's arms. And he had no idea what that promise would eventually cost. The next 3 years were the hardest of Vu's life. And here's the strange part. It wasn't really about being poor again. Vu had been poor before. He knew how to survive that kind of poor, the kind you're just born into, the kind that never gives you anything to compare it to. This was different. This was worse, because for a few years, Vu had known what it felt like to not be hungry, to sit down at a guitar lesson, to wear a shirt that actually fit him instead of one handed down from someone else. And now, all of that was gone, and he wasn't a small child anymore who could just adapt without noticing. He was old enough to understand exactly what he'd had, and exactly what he was losing. In real time, piece by piece. There's a kind of poverty you're simply born into, and you never really question it because you don't know anything else. And then there's the poverty that comes after you've already tasted something better. That kind doesn't just take your money. It takes something much harder to name. Some part of Vu, watching his family fall apart all over again, started to believe something no 15-year-old should have to believe. That maybe it would have hurt less to have never had any of it at all. The fighting at home got worse. The debt piled up. There was a night, near the end of high school, when Vu came home to ask his parents for tuition money for an extra class, one he needed to prepare for his college entrance exam. He walked in on his father and mother in the middle of an argument. His father had been drinking a lot around that time, not because he was a bad man, because he was drowning in more stress than he knew what to do with. And right as Vu walked through the door, his father said one sentence that would quietly change the rest of his son's life. "We don't even have money anymore. What's the point of you studying at all?" He didn't mean it. He was just a man in pain, saying something he'd take back the second he calmed down. But Vu heard it, and whatever he'd walked in there to ask for, he couldn't ask for it anymore. He turned around, went to bed without saying a word. He didn't sleep that night. The next morning, he told his parents he wasn't going to that extra class anymore. But instead of telling them the truth, he said it wasn't worth the money, that he could study just as well on his own. He didn't want them to know what he'd overheard. He didn't want them to feel any worse than they already did. That night became the night Vu decided something. He was going to get into college with everything he had, not because someone was pushing him, because it was the only road out he could see. He studied alone after that. No tutors, no extra classes, just Vu by himself with the stubbornness that came from somewhere he couldn't fully explain. And somehow, he got in. He became the first person in his entire extended family to ever be accepted into a university. He arrived in Saigon, Vietnam's largest city, the place where almost everyone in the country eventually goes to chase something bigger. With a beat-up 50C motorbike and less than $100 to his name, that was genuinely everything he had. His first year, he lived in the university dorms, surviving on almost nothing. But by his second year, he had to find a rental of his own. What he found was a tiny room where the bathroom didn't even have a real door, just a rusted sheet of metal that didn't reach the ceiling. It was the kind of place built for people with nowhere else to go, and Vu was now one of them. So he got a job, his first one ever, serving at wedding banquet halls. One of those jobs nearly every broke student in Saigon has done at some point. Classes in the morning, events in the evening, sometimes riding an hour out of the city on the back of a friend's motorbike, just to work a single wedding for the equivalent of $3 or $4. He saved almost every bit of it. After 6 months, he'd saved a little over $200. That was when Vu made his first real move. He'd noticed something browsing an online classified site, people selling things in a hurry, desperate enough to price them well below market value. Vu had a little capital sitting idle, so he bought a used motorbike for about $100, cleaned it up, and posted it for resale. It was every dollar he had left after 6 months of saving. A week went by. Nobody called. He told himself he'd give it one more week. If nothing happened, he'd sell it back at cost and move on. This is the part people forget about stories like this. How often it almost doesn't work. How much of it is just waiting and doubting yourself and wondering if you just made a stupid decision with money you couldn't afford to lose. Then, on a scorching afternoon while Vu was out doing a side job mapping electrical lines to a flooded neighborhood, wading through knee-deep water, pants rolled up, getting paid almost nothing for it, his phone rang. Someone wanted the bike, about $150. He said yes before they could change their mind. After paying himself back, he'd cleared around $50 in profit in 10 days. $50 wasn't life-changing money, but for the first time, the promise he'd made to his mother no longer felt impossible. It felt immeasurable, one deal at a time. That was the moment something clicked into place for Vu. Buy something undervalued. Fix it up. Sell it fast. Do it again. Within a year. Juggling classes, odd jobs, this constant buying and reselling. Vu had turned that original $200 into almost $1,000, built almost entirely out of nothing but patience and a good eye for a deal. Then he found another angle. He noticed students kept oversleeping, missing breakfast before class, grabbing whatever they could on the run. So he made a deal with a woman who ran a small coffee stand near campus. He paid her a monthly fee to set up a bread cart right outside it, mornings only, before his own afternoon classes started. If it flopped, he'd already paid the woman for the month, money he couldn't get back. He sold out completely, every single day. By his third year of college, between the cart, the reselling, and whatever side jobs he could pick up, Vu was pulling in around $1,000 a month, more than most full-time working adults in his city made in the same stretch of time. At night, alone in his rented room, he'd write his goals down on a sheet of paper. 25 years old. His first $40,000. 30 years old. His first $1 million. He still has that piece of paper today. Everything changed again when he met a woman about 7 years older than him, who sold real estate in one of Saigon's wealthiest districts. She spoke fluent English. She casually made more in a month than most people made in a year. And Vu, who had never once in his life been able to walk away from a payday, was hooked instantly. She got him an interview. The pay was almost nothing. A base salary barely enough to cover gas, and if he didn't close a sale, he didn't get paid at all. But Vu couldn't stop thinking about the numbers she told him. What a single sale could pay out. Thousands of dollars in commissions, sometimes $1,000 or more, for closing one deal. To a kid who'd spent years chasing spare change off a bread cart, that number didn't sound like a job. It sounded like a shortcut to everything he'd written on that piece of paper. So Vu quit every other job he had, put his degree on hold with 1 year left to finish it, and walked in anyway. No base pay worth mentioning. No savings to fall back on if it didn't work. He worked 7 months without closing a single deal. Not one. He watched a coworker steal a client out from under him mid-negotiation, right when the sale was about to close. He spent nearly everything he had on his very first suit, close to $500. More money than he'd ever spent on clothing in his life, and it still looked cheap standing next to men who'd actually sold things before. 7 months in, he was ready to quit. He was behind on rent. He'd started skipping meals to make it stretch. Then, one night, sitting alone and frustrated, Vu did something he hadn't really done before. He sat down and studied the market for real, not the way his managers told him to sell, the way it actually worked underneath. He found a product type almost nobody wanted to touch, a brand new category called resort real estate, barely a year old in the Vietnamese market, considered next to impossible to sell. Everyone told him it was a dead end. He didn't listen. He spent weeks learning that product until he understood it better than the men who'd built it. He studied cold calling techniques late into the night. And slowly, he learned something that would matter for the rest of his life. The best salespeople aren't the ones who talk the most. They're the ones who actually listen. 2 months later, Vu closed his very first deal, then 36 more. In that same month, for years, Vu had believed hard work was the answer. Now it looked like he'd found something even better: speed. Within 6 months, he'd earned the equivalent of more than $125,000 in commission. He was 22 years old. He bought a car, a different suit for every day of the week, an apartment downtown. When his company's sales director quit and poached most of the team, Vu stayed loyal. He rebuilt an entire 50-person sales division from scratch in 2 months and was rewarded with the title of sales director himself. By 26, he wasn't just closing deals anymore. He was a business partner, 50% equity in a company worth roughly $1 million US, personally handed the keys by the men who used to be his bosses. The 26-year-old running a company worth $1 million. By every measure Vu had ever set for himself, he'd made it. The boy who once crawled through a gap in a locked door to steal bananas for dinner. The teenager who once overheard his own father wonder out loud if education was even worth the money anymore. He had built, with nothing but stubbornness and a good eye for an opportunity, exactly the life he'd sworn to give his mother that night in their front yard. He had the money. He had the title. At 26 years old, Vu believed he was unstoppable. Becoming a partner meant a new company, and a new company meant a new office. 2 full floors of a building in Bintan, with a separate room built just for entertaining guests. He called it the luxury room. It felt good. It felt like proof. But running a company isn't the same as closing deals. Vu didn't understand that yet. He made decisions from his gut instead of the numbers. If a top performer closed a big deal, He'd hand out a massive bonus on the spot, no spreadsheet, no plan behind it. For a while, sales were strong enough to cover for it. Then the first quarter ended, and the company was already bleeding money. Vu didn't know how to read a financial report. When his mentor sat him down to go over the books, Vu listened to things that genuinely stunned him. To protect the business, they came to an agreement. From now on, every major decision Vu made had to be approved by his mentor first. On paper, it made him feel smaller, but some part of Vu, the part that still remembered crawling through a locked door for bananas, knew he needed it. The company survived its first year, and Vu's own cut came out to somewhere around $140,000. He sent money home that year. Real money enough to help his parents finally climb out from under the debt that had wrecked their family a decade earlier. He invested the rest into land, stocks, and for the first time, into himself, classes, books, anything that might make him sharper. By every number that mattered, Vu was winning. For most of his life, Vu believed money was the answer. Money would protect his family. Money would earn respect. Money would make him feel safe. By 26, he had more money than he ever imagined. He had paid off family debts. He had kept the promise he made to his mother. And yet, something still felt missing. For the first time in his life, Vu was forced to confront a possibility he'd never considered. What if money was never the thing he was really chasing? The problem with winning too much too fast is that you start to believe you are the one controlling the gravity. And that's exactly when the floor gave way. It started with drinking, not the casual kind. Vu had joined a group chat, 20 or so executives across a dozen partner companies, all older than him, all men who'd built their careers the way men in that industry often did, over endless dinners, endless bottles, endless nights that started as business and ended as something else entirely. At first, Vu went because it made sense. Relationships mattered in this business. The tighter the bond, the more deals flowed his way. Then it stopped being about business. There's an old piece of advice that gets repeated in Vietnam, passed down like a warning label. There are 3 places that will ruin a man if he keeps going back to them: places of drink, places of gambling, places of vice. Vu was about to walk face first into 2 of the 3. The drinking became daily. The dinners moved from restaurants to private rooms and the kind of venues where the wine lists cost more than a month of rent, and the hostesses were paid to make sure a man never felt anything but adored. Vu had a girlfriend by then. He'd had her for years, a woman who'd stood by him through the leanest stretch of his climb, back when there wasn't much to offer her beyond promises. He told himself he wasn't interested in anyone else. That lasted until it didn't. One night, one of the older men in the group noticed the way Vu kept glancing at a particular woman working the room. He didn't say anything. He just had her seated next to Vu. Vu let her stay. They talked. She was 2 years younger than him. It turned out they'd gone to the same high school, just different years. That should have been nothing. Instead, it became a reason to keep talking, and talking led to texting the next morning. And texting led, 3 months later, to something Vu had never planned on doing. He came home that night completely wrecked. His girlfriend cleaned him up, put him to bed, the way she always did. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, he woke up thirsty, got up for water, and looked back at her asleep beside him. Something in him softened. He thought about the laptop she'd handed him years earlier, so he wouldn't have to spend money he didn't have. He thought about every night she'd waited up for him. He blocked the other woman's number that night. It lasted 3 days. Vu will tell you now, years later, that infidelity works exactly like gambling. It's easy to walk into. It is brutally hard to walk back out of. Once something's been triggered in you, that particular rush, that particular hunger, you don't get to just decide it's over. Your body doesn't care what you've promised. He unblocked her, and from there, it wasn't really a choice anymore. It was a routine. He started drinking with someone new almost every night of the week. Every session needed a woman at the table, or it didn't feel complete to him anymore. His girlfriend told herself it was work, client dinners, networking. She didn't let herself look too closely at what her boyfriend was actually becoming. He wasn't cruel to her. That's the part that makes it worse somehow. He still loved her, In the vague way a person loves something they've stopped looking at. But love, when you stop paying attention to it, doesn't stay the same size. It shrinks, and the space it leaves behind gets filled with whatever's easiest to reach. For Vu, what was easiest to reach was more. More drinking, more women, more proof that he could have anything he wanted because for years now he had. It didn't end quietly. One night, during an argument neither of them even really remembers the start of, Vu said something he didn't mean. Something about how if she wasn't happy, she should just leave. He meant it the way people mean things when they're angry. Not at all, really. But she didn't hear it that way. She went quiet. She cried for a long time, and for the first time in years, Vu didn't go comfort her. A few nights later, he came home late, drunk the way he always was by then, and she was gone. On the table, she'd left a letter. Vu still has it. There were 3 lines in it. He says he will carry to his grave. She wrote that she used to see him as her sunrise, the thing that sheltered her after a childhood spent without a mother, craving to be loved by someone who'd actually stay. She wrote that she'd smelled another woman's perfume on him more than once, seen the messages, and said nothing because she told herself it was just the pressure of his work, and she didn't want to make things harder for him. And she wrote one line that Vu has never been able to shake. "You will never for the rest of your life find anyone who loves you the way I did." He read it, and instead of the relief he should have felt, the thing he'd apparently wanted, his whole body started shaking. He grabbed his phone. She'd already blocked him. He got on his bike in the middle of the night and rode around the city with no idea where to even start looking. Because for years she'd only ever existed inside his own life. He didn't know who her friends were anymore. He didn't know how she spent her days. He never found her that night. Years later, Vu would say losing her hurt more than losing 6 figures. At the time, he had no idea he was about to lose both. For a week, all Vu did was drink. He should have felt free. He felt like something had been carved out of his chest. Eventually, the ache dulled the way aches do, mostly because there was a new relationship there to cover it. A woman he'd met through a luxury property deal, someone even more beautiful than the last. Someone he showered with everything money could buy. 5 months in, on a video call with her, a man's hand suddenly grabbed the phone from her side. "Who is this?" Vu already knew the answer before he asked the question back. He wasn't the only one. He'd never even been the main one. He was the affair inside somebody else's affair. They ended it right there, mid-call, with nothing left to say. But the universe wasn't done correcting his ego. While Vu was busy chasing shadows in his personal life, the business he built was quietly preparing to self-destruct. A man in Vu's drinking circle quit his job to start a rival company and took most of Vu's best salespeople with him. Vu's mentor, his co-founder, the man who trusted a 26-year-old with half the company, was suddenly staring down the collapse of everything they'd spent the past year building. Vu stayed. Loyalty, or maybe guilt, or maybe just the fact that some part of him still needed his mentor's approval more than anyone else's. He threw himself into rebuilding what the rival had gutted, hiring and training a fresh 50-person team from scratch in 2 months flat, the second time in his career he'd had to do it. His mentor never forgot that, but the drinking never stopped. If anything, it got worse. Now there were partner dinners to attend, deals to entertain, a whole network of relationships that all seemed to run through the bottom of a glass. 2 quarters in a row, the company posted a loss. Real losses, the kind that make investors nervous. His mentor sat him down, told him gently that maybe he wasn't ready to run the operation the way it needed to be run, that they should bring in someone else to handle the company side while Vu focused purely on sales, the thing he was actually great at. It was the right call. Vu knows that now. At the time, drunk on more than just liquor, he heard it as a betrayal. He put in the most capital. He'd stayed loyal when everyone else left. And now he was being told to step aside. He said something he'd regret. Told his mentor that if that was the decision, he'd pull his money out entirely. His mentor let him. After everything was settled, Vu walked away with $200,000, a fraction of what the company had once been worth. His mentor offered to keep him on as sales director anyway, Same salary, same commission. Vu refused. Pride, by then, mattered more to him than logic. That night, he stood on the balcony of his apartment, 17 floors up, looking out over a city that had given him absolutely everything he'd ever asked for. Below him, Saigon kept moving. Traffic, lights, people chasing tomorrow. 17 floors above it all, Vu had never felt more alone. 29 years old, a car worth over $40,000, 3 pieces of land, an apartment downtown, roughly $600,000 in total assets, all built entirely from nothing. And he couldn't explain why none of it felt like enough. He thought about the version of himself who used to write goals on a scrap of paper in a room with no bathroom door. That version of himself had been happier, somehow chasing something than this version of himself was, having caught it. There's an old belief in Vietnam that everything a person enjoys before they turn 30 is really the accumulated fortune of the family that came before them. And everything after 30 is entirely their own doing. Vu was about to find out exactly how true that was. Standing on that balcony, he was about to be handed something far more dangerous than bad luck. It was about to hand him a man who seemed, at first, like exactly the kind of person he needed. The man's name was Phong, and Vu liked him instantly. Phong couldn't hold his liquor at all. 6 or 7 beers in, and he'd be passed out cold at the table. Every single time. It never stopped him from showing up for another round the next night anyway. He was good-looking, in the kind of obvious way that should have made him easy to trust, and terrible at reading a room, in the kind of way that should have made Vu suspicious. Women didn't like him much once they actually talked to him. That should have told Vu something too. People warned him more than once. Something about Phong doesn't sit right, they'd say. Be careful with this one. Vu didn't listen. Phong had never actually done anything wrong to him. He was just a guy who liked to have a good time, the same as Vu did now. And there's a thing that happens in life, Vu would tell you later, that nobody warns you about early enough. Whatever frequency you're putting out into the world, the universe sends you people who match it. When Vu was hungry and disciplined and building something, the people who showed up in his life were mentors, women who believed in him, bosses who saw something worth investing in. The moment Vu started chasing pleasure instead, the universe adjusted its guest list accordingly. Vu and Phong opened their second company together in November of 2019. 12 people total, no more. Vu had learned something from watching bigger real estate operations bleed money on payroll. Most companies only ever had 20 or 30% of their staff actually closing deals. The rest just sat there, taking up a desk, taking 2 to 4 months to sell a single unit. So instead of building a big team, Vu built a small, brutal one. 12 of the best closers he knew, personally trained, personally vetted. And instead of pouring money into headcount, he poured it into something almost nobody else in the industry was doing yet: Facebook ads. It was 2017, maybe 2018, when older buyers in Vietnam, the actual people with the money to buy property, started showing up on Facebook in real numbers for the first time. Vu had been fast with technology since college, ever since a Singaporean self-help book taught him the basics of running an online storefront, years before the advice in it went stale. He watched the pattern repeat itself. Whoever moves first on a new platform wins big, before everyone else catches up and the advantage disappears. While every other agency was still cold calling off purchased lead lists, Vu's tiny team was running ads. Buyers were finding them. They also had a quieter advantage. A friend from Vu's old drinking circle now ran the primary sales agency for a new development in District 2. The two of them struck up an arrangement. Not exactly legal, just the kind of thing that happens constantly in an industry built on relationships. Vu's team got early access to the best units before they were publicly released in exchange for feeding qualified buyers back to the friend's company. It worked. In 2 months, Vu's 12-person team had locked in bookings on more than 30 units. If even half of them converted to real sales, the company would already be profitable. Vu felt invincible again. His new company ran like a machine. He'd become obsessed with a movie by then. The same one everyone in his industry seemed to worship. The Wolf of Wall Street. He read everything about Jordan Belfort he could find. He used Belfort's straight-line sales method to train his team. Before every big push, he'd play his team the speech. The one where Belfort tells his sales floor that he's been poor and he's been rich and he'll choose rich every single time because it's better to cry in a Ferrari than smile on a bus. It's a hell of a speech to hear when you're broke. It hits exactly where it's supposed to. He memorized Belfort's speeches. He forgot the ending. What Vu conveniently forgot, watching that movie on repeat, was how it actually ends. Jordan Belfort goes to prison. Vu remembered every line about wanting more. He forgot the part where wanting more eventually destroys you. Every weekend, Vu and Fong took the whole team out. Drinking, karaoke. The same lesson, over and over. If you're a man and you're making money, you're supposed to spend it. That's what proves you're really winning. Then, in February of 2020, the news started talking about a virus in China. Vu's project was supposed to launch at the end of March. Instead, the country went into lockdown. Buyers who'd already put down deposits started demanding refunds. The launch that was supposed to save the company turned into an online-only event. Nobody had the heart for. How do you sell someone a dream home over a video call while they're terrified to leave their apartment? Out of nearly 40 bookings, Vu's team closed 6. 4 months of overhead, marketing spend, $20,000 gone and only $10,000 coming back in. A loss of about $10,000 in a business that was supposed to be printing money. Around the same time, Fong came to Vu saying he was short on cash. Could Vu just advance him some money out of the company account? He'd pay it back once his own deals closed. Vu, still confident, still trusting, said yes. A little over $4,000 gone, handed over on nothing but a handshake and a promise. It would become one of the more expensive lessons of Vu's life. He thought having someone else keep the books made him smart, efficient. The truth was simpler and uglier. A business owner who personally controls the cash, with no real system watching over him, is the most dangerous person in the entire company, especially a business owner who already had a taste for spending whatever was in front of him. Then, in 2021, the second wave hit. Worse than the first by a wide margin. Vu made a decision that year that he still isn't sure was right. His 12-person team wasn't struggling financially. Most of them had savings of their own, people who'd been closing deals for years. But Vu kept paying full salaries anyway, month after month, while the company brought in nothing. He told himself it was loyalty. He told himself these were his brothers, not his employees. By the end of that year, he'd lost the equivalent of around $25,000 and hadn't earned a cent. He was still telling himself it was temporary. A rough patch. Something you pushed through. What came next was far more dangerous than a bad year in business. Gambling. By early 2021, Vietnam was deep into its second wave of lockdowns, and Vu was going quietly out of his mind. He was living alone by then. Bored in a way that felt almost physical, restless enough that most nights, he'd end up texting one of the women from his old drinking circle, just to have someone to talk to. Someone to fill the apartment with a little noise. One night, stir-crazy and sick of his own company, he called Fong. They couldn't meet in person. The city was under strict social distancing orders, so they ended up drinking together over video call. Instead, 2 men in 2 separate apartments, a few beers deep into a conversation about nothing in particular. That's when Fong mentioned he'd gotten into something new. Something that was making him real money, he said, doing basically nothing. Vu asked before he'd even finished the sentence. Why wouldn't he? He had no income coming in. Watching his savings quietly shrink every week, he sat at home with nothing to do. Fong explained it loosely. A guy he'd recently met, someone who ran a private group for traders. Fong had put some money in with them and already pulled out a nice profit. Vu asked to see it. Fong pulled up a screen full of candlestick charts, the kind you'd see on any stock trading app, and placed 3 trades right there on the call. All 3 won. He walked Vu through it like a professor. See this candle pattern here? That's a reversal signal. Enter right at this point, and the odds are heavily in your favor. See this one at the top? That's the market about to turn down. it sounded, to a man with nothing else to do and money bleeding out of his savings account, like exactly what he needed. That night, Vu went down a rabbit hole online, reading everything he could find about legendary traders, men who'd turned a few $1,000s into fortunes during market crashes, stories that read like scripture to anyone hungry enough to believe them. Every video he found was another confident stranger promising the same thing: you can learn to read the market and the market will reward you for it. Most of what he was watching wasn't trading education at all. It was marketing for gambling platforms dressed up in financial vocabulary. All he knew right then was that this felt like his people. He'd made real money before by studying something harder than anyone else in the room. Why not this? He practiced first the way any careful person would. A demo account, fake money, real charts. He started with the equivalent of $4,000 in play money. In 3 days, he turned it into almost $100,000. Obviously, it was fake. Obviously, that should have told him something about how the numbers were designed to feel. Instead, it told Vu that he might be a natural at this. He asked Fong to add him to the real group. It ran through a messaging app, a private channel where a guy Fong called his own guru, someone Vu never actually met, never even learned the real name of, would post trade signals during set windows each day, and everyone in the group would place the same trade at the same time. At the end of each month, if you'd profited, you sent the leader 20% of your gains as a thank you. Vu started cautious, $1,200, just enough to see if it was real. 2 weeks later, it had grown to nearly $2,000, 50% up. Compared to the stock market, that felt absurd, so he added more, rounding his account up to about $4,000 total. Not out of greed, he told himself. Just enough that a good month could cover his company's payroll. At the end of the month, he sent his profit share to the group leader, about $500. The leader wasn't impressed. Everyone else in the group, he said, put in a minimum of $12,000. $500 barely covered his trouble for a month. It should have been a red flag. A stranger openly pressuring people to bet bigger. Instead, Vu's pride got in the way. Who was this guy to talk down to him? The next month, he deposited about $12,500. The first week of that second month, the signal started losing, over and over, on setups that looked identical to the ones that had worked before. His $12,000 dropped to $3,000. It clawed back up to $11,000. Then a losing streak wiped it out completely. Vu called Fong that night. Fong had lost everything too, he said. Small comfort, but comfort all the same. Misery, it turns out, really does love company. Vu drank himself numb and told himself it was over. A rough investment. A lesson learned. The next morning, Fong called with an explanation from the group leader. The market had been unusually volatile the day before. Apparently everyone in the group had gotten wrecked. Nothing personal. And there was good news. If everyone pooled a little more capital, the leader could help recover the losses. No commission this time. As a show of good faith, Vu asked carefully if that meant betting again with the exact same setup that had just wiped him out. Fong confirmed it did. And this time, for the first time in his entire saga, Vu said no. There should be a limit to everything, he told Fong. He'd already drained $40,000 from the company. He wasn't about to drain what was left of it chasing a loss on someone else's word. By May of 2021, when Vu finally added it all up, the damage came to nearly $110,000. $40,000 in company funds, $40,000 in this trading scheme, another $30,000 or so burned through nightlife and indulgence over the previous 2 years. All told, the total loss was over $110,000 gone. He closed the laptop. The apartment was silent. 30 years old, $110,000 gone. Nothing moved. He'd just turned 30. The $1 million he'd once written on a scrap of paper felt like a joke now. He quit the group, but quitting the group didn't mean quitting the idea. Some part of Vu still believed there was something real underneath all of it. That if he just learned the actual mechanics himself, instead of blindly copying someone else's trades, he could make it work. So he taught himself technical analysis, momentum indicators, volatility bands, the whole toolkit real traders use. He filled a notebook with entry rules copied off YouTube tutorials from strangers who called themselves master traders. Buy when the price dips low enough and the momentum gauge says it's oversold. Sell when it says the opposite. He genuinely believed he understood something now. He'd already turned 4,000 fake dollars into 100,000 once, hadn't he? What Vu didn't understand, what nobody in that world was ever going to explain to him, is that what he was playing wasn't really trading at all. It was a gambling platform wearing the costume of one. The charts were real. The indicators were real. But the actual bet was whether a price would tick up or down inside a window of 30 seconds, 60 seconds, 5 minutes at most. A time frame so short that no indicator on Earth could meaningfully predict it. Technical analysis is built to read trends over days, weeks, months. Inside a 60-second window, it's noise. A coin flip wearing a business suit, and the house doesn't even offer you fair odds on the coin flip. Win, and you get paid out at something like 80 cents on the dollar. Lose, and you lose the whole dollar. The mat is built to bleed you slowly, even if you're right half the time. Vu didn't know any of that yet. He only knew he'd been cautious once, and it had cost him almost nothing to test. So he deposited $4,000 of his own money and told himself, one loss, and he was done for good. He won. Not huge, but steady. Almost $1,200 in the first week and a half, enough to feel like validation. By the end of the first month, his $4,000 had grown to $6,000. Here's the part Vu wants people to understand, more than any of the numbers. The money wasn't actually the dangerous part. The feeling was the feeling of being right. The feeling of having finally found the thing he was good at, the shortcut nobody else had figured out. So he added another $12,000 on top of it. Because if this worked at $4,000, it would work even better at $16,000. He traded day and night after that. Barely slept. By the end of the second month, his account had bled down to just over $1,200. Sitting there, staring at a number that had once been over $16,000, something close to clarity hit him. How could I be this stupid, he thought. I already told myself I was done chasing this. Why did I put more in? He was ready to walk away for good, right up until he decided, almost as a final act of defiance, to bet what was left of it all on one last trade. It shouldn't have worked. By every rule of a game engineered to bleed him slowly, it shouldn't have worked. It worked. The trade won. So he pushed the winnings into the next one. That one too. He kept going, chasing the streak instead of walking away from it. And for a few surreal hours that afternoon, every single candle seemed to bend exactly the way he called it. From 2 in the afternoon until almost 10 that night, Vu sat in front of his screen watching a dead account claw its way back from the grave. $1,000, then $3,000, then $8,000, then past his original $16,000. By the time he finally stopped, stunned and shaking, he'd turned a wrecked account into something close to $20,000, conjured out of what should have been a total loss in under 8 hours. He'd never felt anything like it in his life. Not the day he closed 36 deals in a month. Not the day he became a business partner at 26. This felt bigger, somehow, like he cheated something much larger than a screen full of candlesticks. He sat back in his chair and started laughing, half in disbelief, half in relief. Then he went to withdraw it. The platform wouldn't let him. Not out fully, anyway. There was a limit. Some obscure rule buried in the terms he'd never bothered reading. Something about only being able to withdraw an amount equal to what he'd originally deposited. The rest, the profit, the part that mattered, sat frozen behind a wall of verification steps and customer support messages that took hours to answer, if they answered at all. Vu stared at the screen. $20,000 sat there, visible, real, and completely out of reach. But the platform holding his money hostage wasn't the end of the story. It was just the bait, because over the next few months, Vu would lose more money than he had made in the previous decade. The promise he made to his mother at 15, he had kept it. But to keep that promise, he had lost almost everything else. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to find out exactly how far he'd have to go to get it back. And when you're desperate enough, you don't just look for a way to get your money back. You start looking for a way to get your life back, even if that way is straight into the dark. That's where we're going to leave him. Not because the story stops there. Because what comes next deserves its own space. Subscribe if you want to see it, whether he claws it back or loses everything he has left trying. What part of Vu's story stayed with you? Drop it in the comments. And if any of this looked familiar to you, the email's in the description. No judgment.